This video is sponsored by War Thunder. This summer, I was feeling kind of bored. So, like any normal and well-adjusted person, I went to Afghanistan. I don't even have to introduce Afghanistan to you. Everyone and their mothers has heard about this country for practically the last 50 years, and the infinite forever wars that have ravaged this country and exclusively ended in a humiliating defeat for every single dumbass who attempted to invade the nation. But besides constant gunshots, suicide bombings, and bearded men strapped with AKs, this country has a lot more to it. So, let me show you what my white boy summer was like and show you the real Afghanistan. First and foremost, Afghanistan is a country located in a sweet spot between Central and Southern Asia, and it borders 6 countries if you're not an Indian who cares about Kashmir. Those being, in the south, Pakistan, in the west, Iran, in the northwest, Turkmenistan, in the north, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and last but not least, in the east, Serbia and Hungary's future overlord, China. The majority of the country is mountainous, with the Hindu Kush mountains and central highlands spreading all across the country. As such, the country has some of the most majestic views in the world. When it comes to the population of the country, Afghanistan is home to roughly 35.5 million people who speak over 40 different languages. However, the 2 official state languages are Persian, which is spoken mainly in the north and central region of the country, and Pashto, which is spoken dominantly in the south. There are also significant pockets of Uzbeki, Turkmeni, Nuristani, Balochi, and Pashai speakers. Its capital and largest city is Kabul, which has roughly 4.5 million people, followed by Herat with 700,000, Mazar-i-Sharif 600,000, and Kandahar with 550,000. When it comes to its history, the country, like anywhere else in the world, has been inhabited since ancient times, which comes as a surprise to absolutely no one. The first major empire that controlled this region were the Achaemenian Persians from the 6th to the 4th century BC, until North Macedonia's greatest hero, Alexander the Great, came with his army and curb-stomped the Persians and consequently took over their empire and Afghanistan, with which the Greek language and culture were introduced. However, that didn't last long, as a century later the Mauryan Indian Empire invaded the south and introduced every spiritually insecure white girl's favorite religion, Buddhism. Then, in the mid-3rd century BC, the Kushan nomads came into Afghanistan who kicked their asses and established their own empire with blackjack and hookers, which lasted until the 3rd century AD. With their collapse, the entire region did a Balkan and split into numerous other small and cringe states, which were sorta controlled by the Iranian Sassanid Empire. But if you're going to know one thing about Iranian empires, it's that they never last, and always get brutally run over by invading armies, like a snail getting run over by a road roller. As such, in the 7th century, the Arabs did exactly that to the Iranians and took their lands under their control, whilst introducing the new and hip religion at the time, Islam. The Afghanis ended up loving this religion but hating the Arabs. So, like the average Guantanamo guard, they got rid of them, and shortly after established the Persian Ghaznavid Empire. But because they were an Iranian empire, the Mongols just had to invade them in the 13th century and destroy their every and any prospects for happiness. But after the Mongols crumbled down themselves, the Timur Empire rose out of their ashes and ruled over Afghanistan up until the 16th century. Then the country became split between the Indian Mughals and the Iranian Safavids, who occasionally fought each other for territory and subsequently ended up murdering their own soldiers for practically insignificant territorial gains. But then at the end of the day, everything is insignificant. So does it really matter? Anyways, in the mid-18th century, one of the Safavids' most beloved leaders kicked the bucket, and the Pashtuns, one of the peoples that inhabit Afghanistan, rose up and took their country for themselves, establishing the Durrani Empire, which controlled most of Afghanistan and Pakistan, even pushing into India and towards Delhi. However, after their first leader died, Afghanistan yet again did a Balkan, only uniting again in the 19th century. Throughout the 1800s, the Europeans were doing European shit and colonizing everywhere where they could place their flag and exploit the locals, which is practically the entire world. As such, Afghanistan was starting to look as a delicious piece of land to add to the European colonial empires of Russia and not so great anymore Britain. During this time, Afghan rulers were tasked with protecting their independence and telling both the Brits and Ruskies to f off, which unlike the vast majority of other countries in the world, they were actually successful at. However, after the First Anglo-Afghan War in the mid-19th century, the Russians and Brits started to encroach further closer to the country. As such, in 1878, the Brits invaded again and occupied most of Afghanistan, making it sort of a vassal state. British rule didn't last that long, and by the end of World War I, the Afghanis revolted against the Brits and secured their independence. Up until the end of World War II, the Afghanis tried to stay neutral and avoid conflict with the empires in the region. However, in 1948, they started to warm up to the Soviets and tried, with their help, to modernize and centralize the government. This eventually raised political tensions in the country as the economic situation worsened. So, in 1964, the country implemented a new constitution and tried to liberalize. But this only continued to raise tensions further, and in 1973, the monarchy was overthrown and the First Republic was established. This was of no help either, as the economy was still falling worse than Korea's birth rate, which prompted the communists to rise up with the help of the Soviets and overthrow the government yet again. However, the rural population hating communism, thinking it was against Islamic values, and would target Islam itself, rose up against the commies, which then prompted the Soviets to straight up invade the country to help secure the communist government's position. The Russians, thinking this was going to be a quick and easy war, were terribly mistaken, and the war turned into a complete and utter nightmare which would last for 10 years. Looking to ruin the Soviets as fun and destroy all hope and love for life, the Americans, Pakistanis, and Saudis, most notably among several other countries, proceeded to provide weapons, funding, and training to the local rebel Afghan mujahedins, who, with guerrilla tactics, kicked out the Soviets out of their country in 1989. But even with that success, the political tensions within the country were still fierce, and 3 years later, the country exploded into a civil war. During the civil war, several factions fought in the effort to take power. However, the Taliban, one of the descendants from the mujahedin, prevailed and quickly took over the majority of the country, finishing the war in 1996. Unlike the previous governments, the Taliban were, how should I put it? A little bit, exorbitantly extreme in their ideology. Unlike the previous rulers they had, the Taliban interpreted Islam fundamentally and aimed to impose their way of practicing the religion onto the entire country. As such, their measures to ensure compliance to their school of thought became extremely oppressive and limited a large number of human rights, in particular those of women, forcing them to completely cover themselves and denying them education and even healthcare. As they were religious extremists, the Taliban also sympathized with other Islamic extremist groups, in particular the group known as Al-Qaeda, whom they allowed to base in their country. They would go on to commit a variety of international terrorist attacks against the West due to them seeing Western military and political involvement in the Middle East as a fundamental threat to Islam and believed that the West wished to completely and utterly eradicate the religion. Their most renowned and infamous attack happened on September 11, 2001 in the United States, where they organized the largest terrorist attack in history by hijacking 4 planes, crashing 2 into the Twin Towers in New York and 1 in the Pentagon, killing almost 3,000 people in the immediate attack. The US insisted that Afghanistan hand over the leader of Al-Qaeda and the perpetrator of the attack, Osama bin Laden. However, the Taliban refused. This prompted the US to invoke Article 5 of NATO and invade the country under the pretense of the War on Terror. This became known as the US War in Afghanistan, which lasted for 20 years, finally ending in 2021. During the war, the US was able to quickly overwhelm the Taliban and depose them from power while installing a democratic regime. However, the new regime was only able to maintain power in urban areas, while the rural ones were able to be kept by the Taliban. Fighting continued for years until the oppositionary regime and the US lost morale. After the US started pulling their military out of the country, the Taliban were able to quickly defeat the government forces and regain territory. The end of the war came in August 2021, with the fall of Kabul, where the Taliban overran the capital as NATO forces were leaving. From then on, the country came under their rule again, and relative stability was achieved. Although at first they were still considered terrorists and no country in the world recognized their rule as legitimate, over the past couple of years, the new government was slowly taken off from the blacklist, and although no major country has still recognized them, diplomatic ties with the outside world have been improving slowly, but surely. But although the war in Afghanistan ended not so long ago, there's still a place where you can experience it. You know it, I didn't even have to mention War Thunder, baby! War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is available now for free on PC and consoles. Take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships of 10 major nations, ranging from biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today, and experience what true modern warfare is like without dying and actually fighting a war, and all from the comforts of your own bedroom. Immerse yourself in the intense combat of War Thunder, where incredibly detailed vehicles with realistic graphics and authentic sound effects place you right at the helm of the most powerful war machines of our time. I mean, the game laughs at simple hitboxes, as they literally made them as realistic as possible and based on actual components and vehicle machinery, so your gameplay experience doesn't get more realistic than this. You also have a game mode for every type of player. If you want something more casual, relaxed, and fast-paced, you got arcade mode, while if you want something to try hard in and actually LARP, then simulator mode is for you. Also join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles today, and delve into the breathtaking experience that is War Thunder. With an unmatched wealth of high quality content to discover, there's simply no game better suited for fans of military history. So what are you waiting for? As I said before, the game is free to play on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox, so go and sign up right now with my link in the description. By using it, you also get a massive bonus pack with exclusive multiple premium vehicles and an exclusive vehicle decorator, Eagle of Valor, as well as 100,000 Silver Lions and 7 days of premium account play, all available not just for new players but returning ones that haven't played for at least 6 months, regardless of platform. But that's only for a limited time only, so click it right now. But enough about the history. Let's talk about the state of the actual country itself, and what better ways to do so than to go there ourselves. You might be wondering, Janos, what in the name of everything good and holy compelled you to come to one of the most dangerous and war-torn countries in the world? Well, that would be this whimsical little creature. In the beginning of the year, I became friends with Lord Miles, also known as India's public enemy #1, after we both realized we were fans of each other's content. As such, we were trying to come up with ways to collaborate, and in that process, dear Miles came up with the idea to go and hike in Afghanistan through its itty-bitty tail, known as the Wakhan corridor, all the way to the border with China and mess with the Chinese border guards. Sounding like the perfect way to spend my summer, I booked the next flight to Afghanistan. And what do you know, in the blink of an eye, founder, Timur Shah, moved the royal court from Kandahar to Kabul. Since the Middle Ages, the city was famous for its grand bazaars, luscious gardens, and being a hustling and bustling urban center in quite the inhospitable environment. However, with the city playing a highly important role for the nation, it also became a great target, as many foreign powers seek to occupy and take control of it for their own benefit. The best example of this were the British, who in the mid and late 19th century during the Afghan wars occupied the city and used it as a military base. In doing so, hundreds if not thousands of ancient and medieval monuments and buildings were destroyed or damaged, as well as the fortress that looks over the city, and even its famous bazaars. By the end of the 19th and throughout the early 20th century, the city then underwent massive reconstruction efforts, and Kabul was finally able to get back on its feet, until the 20th century kicked in. Because of Kabul's and by default Afghanistan's tumultuous and complicated history, the city today is a shell of its historic self, with many of its medieval and ancient buildings and monuments being destroyed and replaced with new modern buildings instead. Which, when you've been the point of conflict for the past century, is quite understandable. Going through the city, the first and main thing you'll notice is the complete and utter chaos. Cars, imported from God knows where, and who've had more owners than pi has decimals, zoom all over the streets of Kabul. No matter where you go in the city, there's always mass traffic on every street. And as there are virtually no traffic lights nor signs, and traffic rules are a suggestion rather than the law, chaos reigns supreme all over Kabul. The only rule that exists in this chaotic environment is that might makes right. So you'll see cars and drivers struggling to merge into lanes, driving faster than the speed of sound, and ignoring pedestrians worse than girls in high school ignored me. Or if you're like our driver, you'll just straight up drive in the wrong direction, which for some might seem like a severe traffic violation, but in Kabul, it's just a normal Tuesday afternoon.
You trying to overtake me?
And of course the smell and taste of car exhaust and smog is ever so omnipresent. Regardless of where you might be, your nostrils will constantly sense the rich aroma of dinosaur juice being combusted and sent into the atmosphere, to the horror of Greta Thunberg. However, contrary to what you might expect with Kabul's chaos, the streets of the city are still surprisingly clean, unlike some other impoverished countries in South Asia. India, where the asphalt of the streets is covered in an additional layer of trash and organic material. Kabul's roads, although completely and utterly disorganized, remain relatively tidy, which especially becomes surprising the more you drive through Kabul and get familiarized with the city some more. Another thing you'll discover about Afghanistan while driving through it is the Afghani love for energy drinks. Every 100 to 200 meters or so, on every major street, you'll find a drink stand selling a variety of drinks, snacks, and cigarettes to the local passerby. The most popular of these is ginseng.
This ginseng right here saved my life. Trust me, I was addicted to crack, alcohol, weeds, feet pictures, everything. I took this, it saved everything. Now, it means I shit 5 times a day. And also I pee blood, and I lose a tooth every week when I drink this. But it's good, it's really good, guys.
But to be quite fair, being 24, balding, driving in a busted up car from 2001 with a crazy Englishman in one of the world's most infamous countries while drinking a questionable liquid is quite the vibe. Moreover, it was a vibe we had to get very familiar with, as that's a good chunk of what we were doing in Kabul. Although the city was great and interesting and all that good stuff, it wasn't our final destination. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, our main goal of our trip to Afghanistan was to travel across the country and hike through its tiny little panhandle through the Wakhan corridor between Tajikistan and Pakistan to get all the way to China, where no Westerner has been since 1947. And in our goal to do so, we were forced to get and fill out millions of permits and forms that will allow us to visit this place. You might be thinking, wow, Janos, that place must be super duper dangerous if you need so many papers to even set foot there. Which is absolutely not the case. The Wakhan Corridor and National Park is an extremely remote area in the country that barely has 15,000 people inhabiting it. It is in the middle of the mountains, in the literal definition of bumfuck nowhere, which wasn't really even aware of there being a war in the country for the past century. The problem was, Afghanistan, despite coming under a new government, kept horrible bureaucratic practices from before communist rule, during it, after it, and just kept on piling on additional bureaucracy due to the state of national emergency the country was in over the years, which as a result makes doing anything in Afghanistan quite difficult. In our party, we had 4 people total, plus our driver. As such, we all had to get a separate permit for every province we'd visit. Permits for recording, and additional paperwork, which I don't even know what for. Which essentially had us going back and forth between offices in town, collecting papers, stamps, and selfies with Taliban guards who found 4 white guys waiting at the office incredibly hilarious. Nevertheless, we still got to see a bit of Kabul on foot. One of the city's most famous and popular spots is the public market. The market lies near a river that has definitely seen better days and is filled to the brim with vendors and customers. Just navigating through the market is difficult as there's always someone bumping into you or coming towards you in the opposite direction. Busy delivery men go back and forth through the market, pushing or pulling wheelbarrows full of products on them. Everywhere you look, you'll find colorful clothes, garments, jewelry, household knickknacks, and everything and anything in between. All the while, there's people shouting and bartering all over the place with smells of food, spices, and some other things attacking your nostrils. Which, if you were misfortunate enough to be born with ADHD, will be a complete another nightmare for you as there's a new stimuli every half a second. Walking through the market, you'll also have a lot of people staring at you out of curiosity because who in the hell comes to Afghanistan to make a video? But even so, they'll give you warm smiles and even ask to be recorded on camera. Of course, if you're ever planning to buy something from a market like this, it is crucial to know how to properly haggle.
So Miles, do you want to tell us how you're supposed to bargain here in Afghanistan?
Okay, so basically you act like an asshole, which is based. So if someone says $100 for something, you offer 40%. Sometimes I go to them and go, what? This 2,000 Afghani? Maybe you don't want to sell. And I start taking it off, and you know, if they offer $100, I say, oh, $40. They go, no, $60. And I go, oh, 45. And they go, $6.50. And then you shake on it most likely. Basically, as well, because you're a white guy, there's like, they think you're rich, which is kind of based, like, you know, they see you as a Jew almost. So you basically get a brown guy to buy for you, and that kind of works out.
However, the main attraction of the market is none other than the bird section. Now, in Afghanistan, one of the most popular pets are birds. If you go anywhere in the country, you'll most likely sooner or later spot a bird cage with some sort of feathered biped in it, ranging from colorful parrots to gray partridges. If it has a pair of wings and legs, well, it can most likely be found in a cage here. The entire bird market stretches down a long alley filled with hundreds if not thousands of chirping birds and old vendors sitting in bygone mud houses. As this is a third world country and one with the highest infant mortality rate in the world, let's just say the condition these birds are kept in is not ideal. But still, pretty cool to check out if you're not from PETA. From the market, we continued further to check out other wonderful tourist sites of Kabul, which took us to the city's hills. From there, you could get a look of the traditional sandstone houses surrounding Kabul, high up in the mounds around the city, as well as get a good look of Kabul itself from above. From there, we continued up one of the hills to go and check out the giant Taliban flag. 8 months after the fall of Kabul, the new winning government of Afghanistan, the Taliban put up this giant flagpole and flag up above the city. The flag consists of black text in Arabic stating the Shahada, there is no God but God and Muhammad is the messenger of God, the Muslim proclamation of faith, on a white background. Up until 2021, this flag was only used by the Taliban as their official symbol. However, after they took over the government, they made it the nation's official flag, replacing the old black, red, and green one. While up there, we met with several Taliban members who invited us to sit and have a picnic with them and eat chocolate and vanilla ice cream. All the while, AK-47s and leftover M16s were next to them, which, to be fair, was a typical occurrence for us while there, as the Taliban can be found all over the place. So quite often you'll be approached by a Taliban member who will be interested in talking to you or even taking a selfie. Which, let's be real, if you're a soy boy European that bitches on Reddit about your city not having enough bike lanes, this might be extremely anxiety inducing to you. However, keep in mind that just as they are exotic and interesting to you, they feel you're exotic and interesting to them, which quite honestly can be an extremely funny dynamic at times.
I'm with the Taliban.
Okay.
They let me have cool photos and stuff. They got these cool glasses on. Look at this man. Look at him. He's got triple drama. He's swimming.
But let's back up a little bit. Who even are the Taliban in the first place? So, remember how previously in this video I mentioned that the Soviets in Afghanistan fought a war? Well, during this war, the US, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan founded a Muslim anti-communist opposition force who were known as the mujahedin. From them came the Taliban, who conquered the country after the Soviets ran away with their tail tucked between their legs. Now, Islam being a large, influential religion, much like Christianity, is split into numerous schools of thought, different ways of interpretation and practice. As such, the Taliban believe in one of the more fundamentalist and radical schools of Islam known as Salafism. Essentially, Salafists believe that the way Muhammad and his early followers practiced Islam was the correct way. As such, their way of interpreting and practicing the religion is much stricter and fundamental, which a lot of times puts them in conflict with other Islamic schools and religious scholars. As such, since taking control, their beliefs and ideology have severely impacted the nation's policies and laws. The most extreme of them are regarding the rights of women, where the Taliban has severely restricted the opposite gender from their participation in public life. Women are banned from partaking in most jobs and majority of the public sector jobs. They also impose restrictions on women's freedom of movement, implemented a dress code, and even banned them from higher levels of education. However, they are not the only victims in the country. The majority of Afghans are subject to a system of law that is a very extreme interpretation of the Muslim Sharia law, at least a version of it. As such, rights like freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion are severely limited, whilst corporal punishment in the form of torture and execution are still quite common. While the Taliban this time around are not as extreme as they were back in the 90s, their human rights record is questionable to say the least. Because of this, although almost every single Taliban we met was friendly, welcoming, and extremely cordial, there were still severe restrictions in what we could discuss and talk about with each other. But even so, we still did talk, which, if we're being real, is the best way to come to an exchange of ideas. Moving back to Kabul itself, of course we couldn't have gone to the city and not visited the Karkha Reservoir, the famous artificial lake with paddle boats with which the Taliban had to use to make victory laps after conquering Kabul and restoring back fundamental theocratic rule. Of course, I couldn't waste this opportunity and not brainwash the local Afghanis about the true nature of Hungary and the injustice of Trianon.
Hungary used to be big. Now I'm in Romania, you know?
After we had our fun in Kabul, it was finally time for us to leave and head into the depths of the country by heading north. To get to the Wakhan, we first had to traverse the Hindu Kush Mountains that lay just outside of the city. The Hindu Kush mountain range stretches for over 800 kilometers throughout Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Tajikistan, where in the east they crush into the Himalayas, which continue further on through India, China, Nepal, and Bhutan. On average, the elevation in the Hindu Kush is around 3,500 meters, with peaks easily getting to the heights of 6,500, whilst the terrain is overwhelmingly rocky with very few plants growing at all. With the mountains being so rugged and inhospitable, the roads that go through the mountains have been extremely difficult to develop and maintain. As such, traversing them was a huge headache as we were essentially stuck driving for hours at the pace of 10 kilometers an hour on unpaved rocky mountain roads, with the car constantly violently shaking as it tried to go across. Unsurprisingly, the conditions of the road bested us and flattened our tire in the middle of our way across. Luckily, we were able to find a place to stop, and a local from a nearby village helped us put on a spare and gave us directions to another town where we could fix our ruptured tire and be on our way. We continued the next couple of hours getting down the mountain until we got to flatlands again and headed for the nearest town where we could replace our busted tire. There we found a car mechanic and were told that the fix would take around half an hour, which after 2 hours of spending there we came to realize was a lie. I didn't get to record this, but while sitting in the car I heard a large explosion next to it, because of which I went out of the car and saw a group of mechanics filling our tire with propane and then subsequently lighting it up with a newspaper which was on fire to make it explode, and then jumping on the wheel rims to get them into the rubber part. So yeah, that was fun. Crossing the mountains and getting our car fixed lasted for an entire day, so after we had that done, we continued further north until we reached some town I can't even pronounce and found a cheap guest house that allowed us to crash in one of their rooms on the floor, which after spending the entire day being rocked back and forth and huge trucks passing us by on endless cliffs, felt as soft as the clouds in heaven. Morning came and then we continued our journey to our next stop, Faizabad. On this road we saw the scenery change yet again, from lush green farming land into dry yellow desert mountains. which truly was a sight to behold. But after we arrived at our destination, we then switched drivers and cars as our previous driver refused to take us further due to the rugged terrain and the bad state of his car. After an hour or so of looking for someone who'd be willing to drive us to the Wakhan, we found someone and were on our way. Following another several hours of driving, we were finally entering the Wakhan panhandle. We went through a narrow valley surrounded by breathtaking mountains on each side, which continued to be our journey for a bit, until suddenly we started to hear pops coming from our sides. As we went deeper into the valley, we were getting shot by the guys from one of the checkpoints. When we got to it, we stopped and asked if they were shooting at us, to which the Taliban responded with a no and expanded, saying that a car that passed us on the road didn't stop at the checkpoint, and that's who they were shooting at. Which, okay, fair enough, I guess? So they led us on our way, and we continued deeper. As evening started to come, we arrived at the last and final major population center before the official territory of the Wakhan National Park started. Of course, being a car full of white boys in the middle of nowhere, the local authorities stopped us. By this point, this was nothing new, as we'd constantly get stopped in every town or village we went through, as well as on the roads itself, as they had a bazillion checkpoints along the way. We thought of it as nothing but a routine checking of documents until a crowd of Taliban started to get around our car. We were asked to exit the car and were subsequently put under arrest. Why? Well, because we didn't have the proper paperwork to come here, dummy! The mass stack of papers we spent collecting in Kabul for this trip? Pfft, that's toilet paper, you retard! We actually needed a special permit from Faizabad, duh! And of course, no one even told us about that, because why would they? Anyways, since it wasn't a big crime, they just put us into some guest house overnight and had some guy watch us. Also, I got some stomach virus, so while we were getting arrested and all that, I was puking my guts out, and the entire village came out to watch me have stomach convulsions and puke out even the tiniest of water I tried to drink. The next day, they forced us to go back to Faizabad to get some papers we were missing. But after driving back for 4 hours and reaching Faizabad, we were told we can't be issued those papers and told we need another set.
So Miles, what seems to be the problem?
No problem. No problem at all. Actually, everything's a problem apparently. So what happened was we didn't have a permit to go to one area, but we got the permit. But then the permit wasn't stamped, so they told us to go back to Kabul. But we didn't need the stamp apparently. We actually went to the wrong office. But then the office also told us we didn't have security clearance to go there. But I'm friends with the head of foreign intelligence, which is kind of a good contact to have. So I messaged the guy underneath him, lovely guy, and he was like, "I can solve this for you, brother. No worries." But you know, it's kind of delayed us by a few days, and I'm going a little bit insane. Like I think the Americans, when they came here, they didn't have the invasion permit, so like they had to fight back. It's insane. I'm just like bashing my skull in, and trust me, there's not much up there. There never was. There never is. I have no idea. I might just get like 500 monkeys and start typing on typewriters to write out all the permits I need throughout history. And finally, I can go to a park, to go on a walk, to go on a hike in a big touristy area. But I'm doing business in Afghanistan, so I'm going to say good stuff, don't worry.
In the end, we tried to get into contact with some of the Taliban higher-ups to sort out the paperwork and get permission to do the hike, but it was unsuccessful, and we just ended up going in circles about needing some mythical documents, with no one telling us on how to get them or going into further details on why we couldn't get them. The only thing they told us was to go back to Kabul, as we couldn't do the hike at this time of year, so unfortunately we had to comply. After reaching Kabul, we were called up for a meeting with one of the Taliban representatives who would give us details regarding why all of a sudden we weren't allowed to complete our hike. It turned out that as we were entering the Wakhan, ISIS had penetrated the territory from Tajikistan and were currently active in the national park. The Taliban, who had been monitoring their activity for months, took note of this and restricted the province for all who weren't from there. As a result, our approved status on visiting changed overnight. Due to serious danger for our lives, the government wasn't willing to let us go alone and offered to provide us with 2 to 3 Taliban fighters for the hike. But as we were short on time and supplies, we had to decline, and our expedition to the Afghan-Chinese border was cancelled. So, to compensate for the lost experience, we went out shooting guns in the middle of the mountains.
I'm declaring TID, total ISIS death dive. Like and subscribe, guys!
Shalom to everyone watching. Now I'm sorry to interrupt the video, but there's something you guys must know. Now guys, I've got authentic Taliban merch at inflated prices. I won't say reasonable prices, I won't say cheap prices, but you know what? It is quality. It's authentic, shipped out of Afghanistan. I'm the one who's only selling it, and also it's shipped from the US. Doesn't violate any sanctions, or so I hope. And at the same time, it's probably legal. Your name might be on a watch list, you might scare away the hoes, and you might also scare your parents who might call the police on you. But that's fine, because it's triple drowned, and you're swimming. Look at this stuff over here, authentic Taliban patches. Special Forces patch, now guys, I'm a special type of guy, you know what I mean? Intelligence patch, guys. Now to work in intelligence, it requires intelligence, and I'm clearly lacking, so this doesn't work for me. But we've got the artillery, guys, and you know what? You're hitting the like and subscribe like you're hitting those targets. This over here as well, Taliban headbands, authentic, and straight to your door. And the prize for jewel, guys, that you guys will like, it's authentic Taliban flag. Now look at this, guys, so shiny, and straight from the source. No one else is selling this stuff, guys, while stocks last. Go to the link in the description. It's also very good because it supports me. It's shipped internationally, straight to your door, authentic Taliban merch at a somewhat reasonable price. If you want an authentic piece from a faraway land like Afghanistan, link in the description, go to my Ko-Fi, go and buy this stuff.
But don't think for a second that the expedition is over. We'll try again next year and get to the Wakhan. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. If you wish to support fur ones like this one, become a member like these wonderful people, or go and check out some of the merch from Afghanistan. Link is down in the description. And again, thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Go click my link in the description to start playing right now and claim your premium rewards in-game. My name is Janusz, and you've watched Living Ironically in Europe.
Hey, why